in the work, I want to be able to address desire, spirituality, love, and have the opportunity to do that.
Like many of the other things that we might look to art for, like the ineffable, the sublime, the abject, beauty seems to... They're all kind of realms of radical uncertainty, which assure us of our kind of subjective autonomy, of our depthlessness as subjects.
We need to differentiate between aestheticization, which is when the seductive power of art is abused and tries to pacify our critical responsiveness to the world, and beauty as, and I quote, an effect of artworks that are ambiguous, complicated, diverse, and that serve to try and, as it were, tickle memory.
Beauty, rather than an inherent quality in an artwork, I am asking myself, it seems to be linked more to the discourse about art, really, and it has a long history within aesthetics, and it is a term that has changed a lot. So the question for me is more whether beauty is a helpful tool in thinking about art in general, and we can discuss that, and also my own practice specifically. And I'm not a philosopher or an academic, so I do not want to get lost into diving into the history and the technicalities of what constitutes beauty. Obviously, we will discuss that. But as an emerging practitioner, you could say, I think it's intriguing to be invited to use the beautiful as a lens to look at art through. It's certainly not something I came across in my training to kind of do that. And I think the art world today, it feels like such a big web of different directions going on at the same time. So it's also interesting, this thing of now trying to say, oh, this is the thing happening, that we are returning. I find it very hard to say that there is an overall general trend here. There are different strategies to make people present with an experience, and also in the meeting with an artwork. So, you have the new or transgressive modes or shock. And in that sense, of course, you also have beauty or something that is delightful or inviting visually, something that has technically baffling, and something maybe that elevates you or kind of brings you somewhere where you can reflect in a different way. It might make you want to, or possible to, return towards the world or return towards radically new ideas too. And in my own practice, I do believe in using aesthetic delight, as the word also was used here in the pitch or the introduction, in my own work, to invite the viewer into it, and having an immersive quality or something very seductive and sensuous in the aesthetic, which also very often is about a somatic or bodily experience that I want to address. Obviously, when people enter into an engagement in the work, there is also all sorts of other things going on in there. It's also a socially embedded work. It has aspects of being a conceptual or conceptual strands or modes. So there is many things going on there. And I owe everything to the early conceptual movement, to Fluxus, early feminist practices, for sure. That's how I see that I'm working from. But I do get a bit tired when I encounter that beautiful work is not intelligent enough, that the only mode of criticality is through rough makeshift aesthetics or anti-aesthetics or this cold conceptualism or shock. In the work, I want to be able to address desire, spirituality, love, and have the opportunity to do that. But I also want to bring up, and maybe we can discuss that later, that artwork that looks right somehow for the art world at the moment, or that fits the trend of the season, falls very flat for me. And I do think that we can see a move towards more formal and material work, especially in young artists coming out. One example is the last New Contemporaries with young work in London. I think there was a lot of things that where artists use formal ploys from classical modernism almost. And it sometimes can come across a bit tame and conservative without any informed, reflected relationship to that tradition. And then it becomes more about surviving in an art world that feels increasingly like a fashion world, where it's about the new and the fresh. And maybe more, so in that way, maybe we can also discuss in the same way as, or in terms of beauty or ugly, also more about what is visible and what is invisible in terms of output and aesthetics.
One of the questions we were asked in the sort of brief was, should art be beautiful? And I was trying to think about this, and I was wondering whether the question came across as a bit silly, sort of like, should the weather be sunny? Well, yes.
Yeah.
And in attempts to answer that question, if you do take it seriously, it seems that you move towards either kind of absurd restrictions which are put on expression. And I mean, these really are like complaining against the weather. It reminds me a bit of Susan Sontag's remarks on the media on photography, where she asks for an ecology of images. In other words, there should be less images, there should be fewer images, we should value them more. I mean, she moved on from that position. It's kind of plainly not anything that's going to happen, so it's a sort of useless complaint in that sense. Or what happens is that beauty gets defined so broadly that anything gets included, and I think that was what was among the very interesting things that Cecil was saying, is that there's lots of things that we can expect art to do for us, and beauty is sort of merely one of them. Now, there have been various kinds of fashions for beauty in the art discourse, and usually from conservative commentators recommending this kind of policing of art. The last that I'm really aware of was in the mid-1990s, with Dave Hickey being the kind of champion of it, along with various other critics, asking for a kind of a market-driven and market-friendly art. He was concerned that, in particular, where too much politics or too much interference from the state was concerned, especially on the biennial scene, you've got all this kind of dour political video art in particular, which no one really liked, according to Hickey, and instead we should celebrate, prettiness. And indeed he put on at Santa Fe his own kind of version of the biennial, a kind of pretty biennial full of flowers and paintings. Very nice. It's interesting that Hickey's been in the news recently complaining that the art world is now terribly vulgar and there's too much money in it, and it's rather like Saatchi's complaints about the art world for very similar things, that they look at the market-driven monster that they've created in the mirror, in a sense, and recoil from what they see. But it may be that, like the fashions for painting, these fashions for beauty are also tied to the market cycle. So, painting tends to do well in the boom periods and less well in the recession, although that seems to be less true for the current one. But it could be that, that the artistic cycle and the intellectual fashions for beauty are kind of tied together. Okay. So, I mean, like many of the other things that we might look to art for, like the ineffable, the sublime, the abject, beauty seems to, they're all kind of realms of radical uncertainty, which assure us of our kind of subjective autonomy, of our depthlessness as subjects, which is a very kind of comforting thing to think. We're all depthlessly profound, especially when it comes to looking at and appreciating works of art. But if it's contingent in this way, maybe contingent on market effects, can we imagine ourselves without it, without the sense of beauty? Malcolm Bull, a philosopher and art historian, has been doing some very interesting thinking on this in a book called Anti-Nietzsche recently, and he was asking about Philistines in particular. And he points out that there are many kind of negatory concepts like atheist and anarchist and nihilist, and that these tend to come into existence before there are actually any real examples of the type. So atheist is used as an insult, not against people who don't believe in God, at least in the origins, but against people who believe in a different kind of God than you do, right? But then, having been brought into a kind of conceptual existence, then people come to occupy the category. And he's asking, well, is the same true of Philistine, perhaps? What would it be like to be a kind of principled, or perhaps just kind of lax Philistine, to say, actually, that doesn't do anything for me at all, you know. And to read Nietzsche as a loser, Bull says. So when Nietzsche says, you know, there's this division of people, you know, and we can divide very clearly the elite and the masses. The elite, among, you know, other qualities that they have, they are the ones who really appreciate the aesthetic. And so Bull is asking, he's not seeking to repudiate that view, but he's sort of seeking to say, well, what's it like to read this and to say, as a loser, you know, that I'm one of the people who really can't do that. That when Nietzsche is complaining about these people, he says, yeah, that sounds like me. Okay. Now, aesthetic indifference was, you know, famously one of Duchamp's aims with the ready-mades, that when he made the urinal and the bicycle wheel and stool and so on, that the idea was that people should not view them aesthetically. One of the things that Duchamp learned was that that's incredibly hard to sustain. It's really difficult to repel aesthetic attention. And maybe that's where nature comes back into all of this, that there's something about ourselves constitutively and our relationships with nature in particular, which are, you know, irreducibly aesthetic.
I work in a slightly different field, which I would like to introduce, which is that my current work is about trauma and the possibility of what I call aesthetic transformation. So, you know, what role would, not sort of whether something is beautiful, but whether something operates by aesthesis, that's to say, things that are not fully cognitive. So it's not just that I sense this table, so it's not sensory perception, and it's not, oh, I know that that's a table because I have a concept of it, but that there are dimensions of experience, which is what Kant wanted us to think about, which is how do we think of something between sense and cognition that we know does something to us. We are affected, or indeed, in some senses, as the psychoanalysts suggest, we are transformed when we have an encounter with something that we think of as aesthetic. So instead of aesthetic being an attribute of something, we say, oh, how beautiful that is, it's actually something that does something, and we search that encounter. So what I'm interested in is beauty as an encounter between aesthetics and ethics when it actually has to deal with the question of horror. And my two areas that I want to throw in around where beauty comes in, one is to do with feminism. So there would be a long time where there wasn't such a thing as feminist aesthetics, because in a way we didn't want to talk about the beautiful. We didn't think art was beautiful at all. We thought art was part of a very ugly system. Okay, and so, you know, what needed to be exposed was the ugliness of social injustice, oppression, the dominant group's self-interest. Art was not pure and beautiful, but wretched in the service of ideology and power that perpetrated injustice and oppression. And the romanticism of aesthetic culture, in which people went around saying, oh, does this move me, was brutally rejected in favor of much more critical ways of understanding art as doing something at the level of political or cultural or social meanings. Now, I don't want to disown that, because I still think that's one of the problems that we have to deal with. But there has been not a sort of David Hickey type turn, because the market world simply says, oh, we got tired of having to think about things very hard. Oh, we don't like politics anymore. Okay, let's have some beauty back. Well, I don't think that. I think it came out of artists struggling continuously with this particularly deep question about what is the aesthetic at a much more profound ethical level. And there is a very strong tendency amongst artists at the moment to make new connections with this aesthetic, namely the affective, the sensory, the synesthetic mode of knowing, and to suggest it's actually a mode of knowing the world. One artist I work with called Ettinger calls it sense knowing. So we're allowing certain kinds of things which would be, oh, does it move me? That kind of romanticism comes back with a new rigorous sort of psychoanalytical underpinning to allow us to still think about that. And that is linked up with the notion that what is, in a sense, beautiful is something to do with care for the other. That we actually encounter something beautiful not because it's an object that someone stands back and says, oh, that's terribly nicely formed like a Tang vase, but there is some dimension in which we are allow ourselves to be affected, to be moved, to be transformed in a relationship to the other. And this obviously brings me to my second area, which is the question to do with trauma. And one of the books I wanted to introduce for discussion is a book called Unwanted Beauty, Aesthetic Pleasure in Holocaust Representation by a man called Brett Kaplan, who asks, can there be any role for things that are apparently beautiful and even in a sense, in the old-fashioned sense, in relation to dealing with a catastrophic breach in the care for the other that is represented by racialized genocide. And beauty has become demonized in that quarter because it's tainted by association with fascism and aestheticization and seducing through an excess of this kind of power of art. Adorno also prescribed art that offered any kind of consolation in the face of the grim necessity to keep true to the enormity of human suffering, and because one can't use any of the models that we have for representing the world that we might consider beautiful for an event so exceptional and so unique. So Brett Kaplan says that we need to differentiate between aestheticization, which is when the seductive power of art is abused and tries to pacify our critical responsiveness to the world, and beauty as, and I quote, an effect of artworks that are ambiguous, complicated, diverse, and that serve to try and, as it were, tickle memory and keep it thoughtful and keep it responsive to the world rather than closing it down.
I'd like to go back to a point which Cecil first raised, but I think everybody has also raised it, which is the notion of beauty, let's stick with beauty for the time being, as something which is discursive. And yet, on the other hand, I think most people, I mean, who are not art historians or perhaps not art critics, would see beauty as an absolute. And I just wondered if you had any sort of concept of, of that, and whether that changes over time, if you see what I mean. I mean, most people would probably say that the paintings of Botticelli or Fra Angelica or something like that were uncritically beautiful, whereas today it would seem less of a given as an absolute. Now, does that mean we're just talking about things which are layered, sedimented, conservative? Where does the discursive nature, if you like, of the discussion of beauty and the notion of beauty as something which is recognizable? I mean, beauty is a term to define. I mean, you might find, we've talked a little bit here as if beauty was, dare I say, transparent, as if it was something that people could, perhaps there was some sort of consensus on. But I don't think that's what any of you are saying, and I'd like you just to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, again, I think, wishing for some kind of unified idea of beauty already is very tricky, I think, because it seemed to be so much more about mechanisms that goes into how we encounter, or what you talk about, how we enter into relationships and what that does with us, and that changes all the time. So also, I guess, from the beginning now, when we were asked to think about this as a return of beauty and what that is, I just find it problematic in essence that we are trying to then needing to give it, a very singular definition.
I accept it's problematic, except in ordinary discourse. I think we have to battle with this fact that people do talk about beauty or the beautiful. And I think we have to, to a certain extent, sort of engage with that when we're talking about it. And the notion of subjectivity and objectivity. I mean, when you talk about, obviously, exploration, you talk about entering into art, all these things, that's absolutely, obviously, absolutely right. But on the other hand, there is some comfort, perhaps, in a set of... You're going to disagree with me intensely with this, because obviously you're going to say, but there is no such thing as a set of standards. But we have to, I think, somehow get the everyday into this discussion a little bit too.
But can I come in there? I mean, I think the thing is, you've got two different things, which is the sort of... I suppose philosophically, when Kant differentiates the beautiful from the sublime, he's saying, okay, the sublime is something that potentially overwhelms me, and then my imagination has to produce a concept to try and contain my sense of overwhelmingness. So we say it's huge or amazing or whatever, whereas the beautiful is without a concept. That's all he just said. It is something for which there is no something. So essentially, any notion that you could derive from Kant a standard, a taste, a set of canonical objects, which we'll all agree about, is false, because in a sense, it's precisely about a certain limit, right? And in a sense, what we say, which is something which we don't immediately struggle to name. You know, in the way which sense we struggle to name the awesome, the overwhelming, the shattering, which sense we do have words for that, but the beauty sort of remains in that sort of way. Now, that's on one hand. On the other hand, every attempt that people have made to come up with a set of ideas as to what is the beautiful is already so invested with various sort of privileges, and people say, how is it that the only things that people have thought of beautiful up until the mid-20th century were made by men? Little suspicious, made by white Europeans. A little suspicious. So we've had to, under the pressure of, internationalization, post-colonialization, questions of gender, to say, maybe there's not just an absolute standard, but there's work you have to do for the, as it were, the radical shattering of the concept to be legible to you. And so I think it's not comparative or relativizing it, but I think it's enormously dangerous where people come up with canons, And I mean, if you say Botticelli, well, actually there's a very interesting argument that actually what Botticelli's work is all about is sorrow. Bellini, just, endlessly these mourning, this figure of the loss. There are other ways we could see it. And why do we find being in touch with something so affective, we find it beautiful, not because it is beautiful, but of what it does in, extending our affective reflections on what I'm saying, the confrontation with something we don't really want to be confronted with, but need to be.
So maybe in that way also, your question, or from your question, it is that we need to return to it again and again without really trying to find this defining answer, but while engaging with it in kind of various ways that maybe has more to do with responding to, I think also in terms of, or with a lot of younger artists I can see now seem to want to be able to be, say, sincere, or seem to be able to want to look for something that might be a stronger and truer experience than something else. And how is that possible if everything is relative, or everything maybe in a scene that seemed much more ironic and hard edge from you could say from the 80s in the art world, and just wanting to address that again, of finding a space to address this kind of deeper thing without maybe actually finding it.
The word truth and true comes in quite a lot, but I'm not quite sure in a sense what truth in art. I'd just like you to say what you mean by truth in art, or art being true. in a sense, because there are again many meanings of true. I mean, a still life can be true in a representational sense, obviously, but art should be truthful. It seems to me something again that we need to define quite carefully. What truthful to what and to whom, and
I mean, it's interesting listening to this, and especially thinking about Griselda's alignment of truth and beauty and
Did I align
ethics.
truth? I don't know. Did I say?
You did say truth, I think. Yeah. Well, you said at least knowing about the world, which implies.
No, that doesn't make the truth. I don't know. Maybe I'll think about that one.
Okay.
Okay.
I mean, it's obviously a very, it's an ideal and very old-fashioned association. Not old-fashioned, I didn't mean to say that. Traditional association, in a sense. And I guess I wanted to, I was wondering, in hearing Griselda speak, whether she thought it was, that maybe that traditional aspect of it is an illusion, in a sense, and that it's because we know in many ways that beauty, standards of beauty, are highly historically variable. They alter all the time. Art movements, especially after they've been, recently completed, go into. Think about the way in which the Victorian art was thought of in the 1960s, or Art Nouveau was thought about in the 1920s and 30s, as abhorrent, right? Before being recuperated. So we know that there's this great variation here. And I was wondering whether, I suppose, in terms of Griselda talking about this type of beauty in relationship to the Holocaust as an exceptional historical event, whether you think there's something about the alignment of our times which is producing a particular kind of beauty, which is then actually described in something which approaches this rather old alignment of ethics, truth possibly, and beauty.
does that also perhaps speak to a greater embrace of a more tolerant society? Because not only do we have representations of the Holocaust, but we have representations of disability. We have to think about the fourth plinth, and the pregnant, the armless. I'm very foolishly forgotten the name of the sculptor.
Mark Quinn.
Mark Quinn. Yes, and it was a woman. I mean, it was an artist who was an artist, and of course Mark Quinn has done other similar things. And so, in other words, our aesthetic has our aesthetic, if you like, become more discursive, but also more generous and more tolerant. Do you think? Is that something? And if that's the question, there's another part. Where does the discordant and the grotesque, doesn't that need redefinition? If beauty needs redefinition, then presumably what might have been considered grotesque certainly needs redefinition. Though of course we've had the grotesques for Bruegel, Gargles. I mean, there's nothing, obviously there's a revisiting.
I was thinking about it also now when in the little text where we get invited about Damien Hirst, for instance. Because when I was sitting and trying to think about the YBAs or what, for instance, or these kind of modes that dealt with the grotesque or shock, he doesn't really spring to mind. For me, that he's actually also really dealing with beauty or something that draws you in on that aesthetic level and balancing something very transgressive, but also something that has that level. So I was thinking maybe something like Paul McCarthy or something still does something to me that is much more visceral and grotesque. It does that thing that is not beauty. It's a different kind of more, it hits me somewhere else. But actually, again, it has almost changed for me that, or Damien Hirst doesn't really seem to be.
It's something I think came across very strongly in his retrospective show at the Tate.
Yeah.
And I think there are certain works there which do deal with the abject and the sublime, maybe fitting the sublime perhaps, and especially 1,000 Years, and the way that piece with all the flies and the electrocution device kind of leaks into the air. You could smell it. I mean, there's something there which is not about beauty. But as you went on through this show, remarkable how kind of just pretty everything became, and very highly decorative.
Don't we have to make a distinction then, to follow on from that, between aestheticization, which can be used, to beauty up, abjection, what it was. And I think what Julian was asking me, which is a sort of question about, what is, when you're talking about the fourth plinth, okay, who gets into representation? Whom are we allowed to see? And how does the artist present that? Would come back to my question of the ethical, right? In what way is Alison Lapper, who is the artist here, presented to us? Is she presented to us in such a way that we say, thank goodness it's not us? Or is she presented to us in such a way that, despite certain physical differences, the sense of the beauty of a pregnant woman is the same? Now, the beauty of a pregnant woman isn't self-evident. It's not a matter of taste. It would be an effect that it would take considerable artistic decision-making and skill to produce. So that's what I'm trying to say, is the aesthetic, the sense of something being beautiful, touches on the ethical. I did say knowing the world, but not in the sense of knowing the truth of the world, but in sense confronting something. I suppose I am sort of talking about historical, political kind of sense of things that have happened, that we do need to know, we should not be in denial of, but not that we know the truth of the Holocaust, we'll never arrive at that, etc. But it's something to do with the question of how you would negotiate things. Like, so much of the art world is without any sense of judgment at the moment, right? We just get churned up stuff and we all think, because it's there, it's got to be taken seriously, and people write about it, and we don't have questions that we could put to say, either is this art or is this not just a one-liner, or is this something that produces this transformation? And it's the form in the middle of that word, transformation. It requires something which is specific to what art does, a formalization. That is. So there are moments in Damien Hirst where you think, where did that come from? Yeah. There's something what I would call, has that sort of, without a concept, and I'm forced to think, what am I looking at? How do I deal with it? So that is, but that doesn't mean that everything that has a Damien Hirst signature is art, or, has that power, which is not beautiful in aesthetics or decorative or pretty sense, okay? And in a certain sense, there's ways you can make a certain account of the pre-Raphaelites that leads not to prettification, but to something else. But it does depend on arguing what does it do and in relation to what, which I think brings back not truth but history. I think that's where I'm asking, when you know the world, it's to know a kind of historical problematic that art can disclose in a particular way. And I don't think it's about what we now show. It's all to do with the specificity of the manner in which we confront it. Does it generate, I suppose, criticality or ethicality, or does it just pacify, console, entertain, distract?
Is there a priority working here through this, in the sense that if you do ethical work through making an art object, then does that for you automatically make it beautiful? Or are there ways of doing ethical work which might lead you in other directions, I wonder? And in terms of historical knowledge, one might think, for instance, about certain kinds of documentary practices, go back to Hickey's bugbear, in video or in photography, which produce results which, at least on the face of it, one might say are pretty ugly, right, or grotesque, or they may be telling very hard historical facts, truths about the world, or referring to them anyway. So I'm just wondering whether that ethical care for the other, as worked through in something which approaches art, always produces beauty.
There's a very, very famous example, because there's a very famous debate in French film theory around a film by Gilles Pontecorvo called Capot, which was the first film made, a sort of fiction film made out of a concentration camp. So it was a fiction film, everybody set it up, and then more or less 2 years earlier, Alain Resnais made Night and Fog, which is one of the most terrifying documentaries you'll ever see. But that is definitely a work of art. Whereas what Capot got criticized by Jacques Rivette for was a tracking shot. And he talked about the morality of the tracking shot. So a woman kills herself on the wires, and what Pontecorvo did was to have the moment of the scene, And then he literally had to build the track so that the camera could track again up to and see this close up. So Rivette said, this is immoral, okay, because you have made the desire to see and see again, oh, see her, this beautiful woman dead. He'd given into that. And so he talked about the morality of René's stop on the image that arrests the image or arrests the spectator so that you can't, your voyeurism, your sadism can't be stimulated. So I think there are not a set of outside, this is ethical, this isn't, but it's at the level of almost reading the aesthetic decision-making. And René said what was wrong with Pontecorvo is he was facing a problem and he hadn't thought enough. And he committed an absolute sort of immorality of feeding voyeurism that once, but literally that shot of tracking back. You see her die, then you see her close up again. Okay.
But I wonder whether we can be sure about that in all circumstances, in a sense, in that, you know, this is a judgment made at a particular time for a particular audience and so on, and that it, you know, it's kind of in a very different register, the kind of debates around Spielberg's Holocaust film, isn't it? I mean, what... Well, just in the sense that, you know, okay, in many ways this is a kind of vulgar and sentimental production, but perhaps there's something necessary about it too. It's kind of, you know.
Well, I think that of all the discussion, I haven't heard anyone before, but this one certainly bears out the title of this whole conference, you know, how the light gets in. The light has got in for me in all sorts of areas of art and beauty that I certainly will go away and think much more about. I would like to thank our speakers very much indeed for an invigorating discussion. Cecil Christensen, Julian Stalabras and Griselda Pollock.